So what is euthanasia and assisted suicide? Because a lot of people have confusion. They think about life support systems, they think about medical treatment, and they sometimes get confused by the term. And I'm going to tell you, let's get right down to what it's about. So what is euthanasia? Well, in the criminal code, it's dealt with under Section 222. Section 222 is homicide. It's murder, right? So euthanasia is a type of murder. Euthanasia is then when somebody directly and intentionally is involved with causing your death. Usually it's done by injection. Sometimes it's done by other means. But the idea is that it's the direct and intentional cause of death. So when people talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide, they come up with lots of different euphemisms. They talk about different ideas. They say it's about freedom and that sort of thing. But really what it's about is giving, usually in this case a physician, the right to be directly and intentionally involved in taking somebody's life. That's what it's about. So when we talk about all these other things, well, is it about the use of medical treatment? Is it about saying no to medical treatment? The answer is no. When we're talking about anything extraordinary, any medical treatment that one might say no to, what is the cause of death when you say no to medical treatment? So let's say, I'll give you an example. Somebody has cancer, and they've had cancer for a long period of time, and now they've decided that they can't further continue the treatment. It's too much for them. Have they in some way accepted euthanasia? And the answer is no. If they die from saying no to the medical treatment, what do they die of? They will then die of cancer. No one intentionally and directly caused their death. So it's not about withdrawing medical treatment. Okay? Treatment is different than some other things like care. Is it about the use of morphine? Because a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, today we like to use morphine to end someone's life. Well, it is technically possible to cause someone's death with morphine if it's abused, right? If you do it inappropriately. But the proper use of morphine does not cause death. We have to understand that clearly. You have to intentionally want to cause someone's death with morphine if you're to actually cause your death with it. Very inoften is that unintentionally. It's almost never even an issue, but it is possible that it could be done unintentionally. But even if it happened unintentionally, it's not the intentional cause of death then, is it? It is somebody trying to provide pain control or analgesic support to someone. There's no intentional death. If they were to die, it's the same as somebody dying on an operating table. People die on the operating table quite often. Did they intend that death? No, it's not euthanasia. It's when we intentionally and directly are involved in causing someone's death. And that's what we have to understand. It's giving the right of somebody to be directly and intentionally involved in taking somebody else's life. And that's why it's dealt with under the homicide provision. It's a form of homicide. Now, there are some issues I want to get into, but I'm going to first say, well, what is assisted suicide? Because assisted suicide is a little bit different now, isn't it? Euthanasia is when I directly and intentionally cause your death. But assisted suicide is a type of suicide. So it's actually under the criminal code in section 241 of the criminal code, which is our assisted suicide provision. And it says we're not allowed to aid, abet, or counsel suicide, which makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense that someone should not be directly and intentionally involved in helping you kill yourself. Doesn't that make sense? Consider the case of somebody going through depression. A lot of people go through chronic depression. A lot of people go through chronic disease, chronic problems. And there's many times where they might feel really down. They might be in a very dark place. Should we be directly and intentionally involved with helping them kill themselves? No, we shouldn't. Of course we shouldn't. And if you consider how prominent, how common suicide is becoming, especially amongst the younger age groups, and even now amongst the elderly groups, the fastest growing type of death for elderly people is now suicide. And we have to understand what's happening, okay? The fact is to be directly and intentionally involved in causing somebody else's death is absolutely wrong. And why is it wrong? Well, because how do you know what's going to happen then? We can't allow people to be causing other people's deaths. But in suicide, you kill yourself, supposedly, how the definition would go. But somebody is directly involved with helping you do that, right? So the criminal code says you're not allowed to aid, abet, or counsel suicide. So when you understand, aiding would mean you're actually directly involved, abetting would be you're encouraging to, and counseling them would be around counseling. There is another issue around euthanasia, and that's the issue of food and fluids. And that's the primary issue. It's based on medical care, basic care. So to intentionally and directly cause someone's death by omission would mean that I have denied them what is basic to their need intentionally in order to cause their death. So everybody remembers the Terry Schiavo case in Florida? Well, Terry Schiavo was not dying. Okay, Terry Schiavo had a cognitive disability. She was probably not getting better, that's true. She was not dying, she was not sick, she did not need antibiotics, she did not need oxygen, she had no problems like that, but she did need to eat every day. And because of her condition, she was receiving food through an insert that was into her stomach. They call that a peg. Now, her husband wanted her to die. He had another wife who wasn't married to her. He had another woman in his life with 2 children with her, and he wanted her to pass away, and the family wanted to care for her. So that's what the whole battle in the courts is about. The family, her parents, wanted to care for her and bring her home and care for her, and he wanted her to die. And so therefore what happened is he won the case, and she was dehydrated to death. So she was intentionally and directly killed by dehydration. If she had had a medical condition, let's say she had cancer, they wouldn't have had to dehydrate her to death because she would have died of cancer. But there was no medical condition for her to die from, so they dehydrated her to death. And this is becoming somewhat common. Now we've all had lots of either coffee or juice tonight, and we all understand that that's not a medical treatment, but it can be a form of care. So you have to understand the distinction, treatment and care. And we have to be very clear about that. Now that's different from someone who's actually dying and nearing death, now isn't it? Because it becomes a time when we're dying and nearing death where we begin to shut down. Those who have been around those like family members or work in hospitals understand that one of the signs of death is that you start experiencing organ failure, etc. And we understand that at that point you can't put food and fluids into a body that can't use it, can you? But it's different at that point, because they're not dying of dehydration, they are nearing death and they are dying of their medical condition. No one's causing their death, we're accepting the limits of life. It's very different from someone who's not dying. So we must make distinctions between what we do based on one who is dying and one who is not dying, and understand there's a clear distinction between the two. So it doesn't seem so difficult to understand now, because we understand it's the direct and intentional cause of death. The other side likes to use euphemisms, so you're going to hear these terms called aid in dying. Aid in dying is the term they like because we talk about assisted suicide, or we talk about euthanasia, which means in fact good death, but in this case it means the intentional and direct cause of death. But they like to use the term aid in dying. Well, why do they like to do that? Well, we all want aid in dying, don't we? If we were suffering and needing support, we would all want aid from our medical team or from our doctors, etc., to help us to be comfortable. So this term aid in dying seems sort of nice, but what it means is it's okay to euthanize someone. That's what it means. So when they're trying to change terminology, it's because they always like to change language before we end up seeing the laws changed, right? You have to change the culture before people come to accept these things. We have to be clear about our language. This is about causing death. We shouldn't accept these euphemisms. Further to that, we have to understand how this works. A lot of people say, well, this is just about autonomy, right? It's about my choice. You can hear that all the time. People say, it's what I do. It's my body. It's my choice. And I ask the question, well, what does euthanasia or assisted suicide have anything to do with autonomy? That's a very good point, because people are going to be saying, you're going to hear this on the CBC, it's all about people just choosing. It's just another form, another choice. But it's not. Why is it not? Well, first of all, autonomy is about what I do with myself, right? Autonomy, if I want to paint this wall and someone's giving me permission, I can paint the wall, right? I'm doing it myself. If my wife loves to change things in the house, eh? She does it all the time. She loves to make changes. So if she wants to make changes in the house, and I say, don't worry, go ahead. It's her own autonomous thing. But if she asks me to do it, then it's not her own autonomy anymore. She's not asking me to do it. It's the same thing with euthanasia and suicide. It's not about autonomy because somebody else is directly involved in causing the person's death. It's not about suicide. It's about euthanasia or assisted suicide. Somebody else is directly involved. It's not about autonomy. We have to make it very clear. It's about giving somebody else the right to cause another person's